Liner Bravo. Romeo. Pilot incapacitation. 2 miles south of Kilo. Bravo. Juliet. Charlie. Emergency auto landing. 19 minutes on runway. 30. Right at Kilo. Bravo.
What you just heard did not come from a simulator, nor some kind of marketing presentation of a futuristic technology concept. No, this was a message sent directly from a real Beech King Air flying with real people on board by a system that was actively flying the plane after its pilot had seemingly become unable to continue handling it. From that moment, a Garmin computer chose an appropriate airport, talked to air traffic control, flew the approach, touched down safely, and then brought the aircraft to a stop on the runway all by itself. Except that this wasn't really the full story here. So in this video, I will break down what actually happened, how a system like this works, and then cover the obvious, bigger question. If this is possible today, and such a technology can save the pilot and everyone else on board this King Air, then why doesn't something similar exist on the airliners that the rest of us fly on? And what else could this system be used for? Well, let's start by first looking at what actually happened inside of that aircraft that I just mentioned. This story broke on the 20th of December 2025, and it involved a smaller aircraft than we normally cover here, a Beechcraft B200 King Air. Which, by the way, was the very aircraft that I did my first sim assessment for back in the day. Anyway, this aircraft had registration November 479 Bravo Romeo and wasn't very new. It had actually been manufactured back in 1984, but it then seems to have received an upgrade, including some very interesting new avionics, which will soon be key in this story. On the 20th of December, this aircraft then made several flights, the longest of which was a 3-hour leg from Oklahoma City over to Aspen-Pitkin Country Airport, and the incident flight came right after that one. Now, because this wasn't a scheduled or even a charter flight, initially we didn't know much more about it, not even its intended destination, but we later learned that the aircraft was probably headed towards Oklahoma City. In any case, according to available ADS-B data, the King Air made a seemingly routine departure from runway 33 at Aspen at 13:43 local time. Now, Aspen is famously a skiing and winter destination, so its airport is located 7,820 feet above sea level and surrounded by even higher terrain. Now, after takeoff, the aircraft initially climbed away on a westerly heading before making a right turn to head southeast towards Oklahoma. But as it climbed through 23,000 feet, about 10 minutes after takeoff, it then suddenly stopped climbing, and the ADS-B data instead shows the aircraft entering a rapid descent, reaching a vertical speed of 4,800 feet per minute, before finally leveling off at 18,000 feet. Now, during that descent, the aircraft also turned to a more northerly heading, before again heading to the east, and shortly after that, its transponder was changed over to 7700. And that obviously told air traffic controllers that this King Air was now definitely experiencing some kind of emergency. That also obviously prompted the controllers to try and communicate with the aircraft's crew, but it appears like they didn't get any response back. And we know this because the controllers informed other pilots in the area that they were dealing with a Nordo King Air.
We've got a Nordo King Air that's also experiencing an emergency.
Nordo means no radio, but this soon changed when a robotic female voice suddenly announced that November 479 Bravo Romeo was subject to a pilot incapacitation and that it would perform an emergency auto landing at Kilo Bravo Juliet Charlie, which is Denver Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. The air traffic controllers then kept monitoring the aircraft, which soon made several more radio calls about its position and an estimated time for landing, as it kept circling down and lining up for an approach into runway 30 right. After that, it successfully landed, about 26 minutes after it had originally stopped its climb, and whilst we don't know exactly how good that landing was, the aircraft was still in one piece and generally in a good shape when it stopped on the runway. And most importantly, the people on board were fine. Better than expected, actually. So what had happened then? Well, plenty of news outlets quickly reported on the fantastic system that had made all of this possible, and with good reason. But what most of them missed, at least initially, was that, as it turned out, this ordeal hadn't involved any pilot incapacitation at all. Instead, unlike what you might expect after something like this, nobody on board had required any medical assistance after the landing. Airport emergency crews had been notified by air traffic control about what was happening, and they were therefore ready and waiting for the aircraft as it landed. But when the plane stopped and they approached it, the first responders suddenly saw two people just simply walk out of the aircraft. It soon turned out that there were no passengers on board this flight. Instead, both of those occupants were pilots who had been doing a Part 91 ferry flight intended to reposition the aircraft to its home airport. Now obviously, people not needing hospital attention is good news, and as a bonus, the plane was in good enough shape to be flown into Oklahoma the next morning. But again, what had actually happened then? Well, to understand that, we have to talk about Garmin's Autoland system and the reasons that it exists. Garmin is a company that makes avionics used in many general aviation aircraft, corporate jets and other aircraft. That's both newly produced and existing planes that could use some updated avionics, like this 1980s Beech King Air, for example. Unlike commercial jets, many of these relatively small but high-performing aircraft are meant to be flown by a single pilot, which obviously comes with some challenges. You see, even when everything goes according to plan, flying single pilot, often under instrument flight rules, in and out of mid-sized airports with plenty of other aircraft to keep an eye on, can be pretty demanding. So, a bit of system automation can help the pilots maintain their situational awareness and therefore increase overall safety. But all that automation means very little if the single pilot on board would experience a medical issue of some sort, or a different problem would arise that would stop the pilot from being able to fly. That would create a potentially catastrophic situation from only one critical system failing. Now, we have seen cases where an untrained passenger grabs the controls and keeps the plane in the air. I actually covered one of those over on the Mentour Pilot channel a few years ago, but that flight was in good weather in an unpressurized Cessna Caravan, and it still nearly ended in disaster when the aircraft initially entered a spiraling dive as the lone pilot on board suffered a cardiac episode. And that's why developing a system that would not only stop such a dive, but actually get the plane safely back down on the ground autonomously was incredibly appealing. So said and done, that's exactly what Garmin set out to do with its Autoland system. But making such a system work in the smaller, high-performance single-pilot aircraft that probably needed it the most was not as easy as it sounds. And more to the point, as we already saw, the pilots of this particular King Air used this system even though they were not incapacitated. So why? Well, I'll get to that in a moment, but it's exactly in situations like this that it would be handy to know a little bit more about what was going on board. This is why cockpit voice and flight data recorders are so critical for aviation safety. But have you ever felt like you would need something similar in your own life? Something that would keep track of your own conversations and then easily highlight the important bits without you having to dig through hours of recordings? Well, that's where today's sponsor, the Plaud NotePin S, comes in. This is a wearable AI note taker designed for professionals. Now, you can pin it to your shirt, wear it as a necklace or use the wristband like a watch, and this thing doesn't just record, it works like a dedicated virtual assistant. Unlike traditional voice recorders, the NotePin S is powered by leading large language models, and it turns meetings into high-quality transcripts with actionable insights so that you can stay fully present in high-stake discussions instead of taking notes. Perfect for a sim debrief, for example. With a single press, it will start recording, and if something important then comes up, you just press the button again, and it will mark the 30 seconds before and after. Later on, the Plaud app will automatically highlight those sections with instant summaries, structured meeting notes, and even mind maps. And also, they have this Ask Claude feature where you can ask anything about your captured content and it would quickly retrieve and provide a trustworthy answer for you. Pretty cool. Now, for lawyers, consultants, and other professionals, privacy is obviously non-negotiable. So Plaud complies with global standards like SOC 2 and GDPR, keeping your data encrypted and secure. Just remember to get consent before recording. Plaud now also offers a 30-day risk-free return. So to try it out, just scan this QR code or click on the link here below. Thank you, Plaud. Now let's get back to the video. Garmin first announced the release of their emergency Autoland system back in 2019, which immediately grabbed the world's attention. And that was with very good reason, since it seemed to solve the single pilot emergency scenario, but also because many people wondered if this could actually spell the beginning of the end of the two-pilot airliners. But when it comes to small aircraft, it's worth emphasizing here that those planes would need to have quite a few other systems on board as well before this emergency Autoland system could even work. For example, the aircraft would need to have flaps and landing gear extension mechanisms that would be controlled by the autopilot and also programmed to use appropriately. And they would also need to have auto brakes in order to get the plane to stop after landing, and obviously auto throttles would also be needed. And in the world of general aviation, all of those are features that even reasonably advanced aircraft don't always have. So Garmin's system would have to include everything needed to address that. But the point here is that this isn't a cheap feature to have, even if we assume that there is such a thing as a cheap new feature on an aircraft, which there isn't. In any case, after an aircraft has been fitted with every needed subsystem and the Garmin Autoland system is also installed into it, this system could then be activated in a few different ways. For example, a passenger can activate it directly by using a button that's placed somewhere in the cabin where passengers can actually reach it. And obviously, that's not what happened to this King Air, since there were no passengers on board. Another activation method would be if the system notices that the pilot or pilots haven't interacted with any of the controls for a certain amount of time. In that case, the system would first prompt the pilot to press a button or perform some type of action that confirms that they're still alert and able to fly, and only after having tried that to no avail would the system self-activate. Finally, something could happen that could directly cause the pilot to become incapacitated, like for example a cabin depressurization at high altitude, and in such a scenario, the system would also prompt the pilot to react in a way that shows that they're still able to fly, and if they don't respond to that, well then the plane would simply take over. And sure enough, cabin pressure was a factor in this event. According to a statement released by the aircraft's operator, Buffalo River Aviation, this King Air suffered a rapid, uncommanded loss of pressurization as it was climbing through 23,000 feet. Now, we obviously don't know how or why this happened, but Buffalo confirmed that the pilots did not become incapacitated by that event. They instead put their oxygen masks on, which is exactly what we are trained to do before anything else in a situation like this. And while they were doing that, not one, but two different Garmin systems were getting activated. The first, according to the operator, was Garmin's emergency descent mode, which was triggered after detecting the increase in cabin pressure altitude and monitoring the crew's reactions. When that activated, it immediately changed the climb into a rapid descent, which is what we saw on that ADS-B data. Now, I'm going to speculate a little bit here, because the moment that the aircraft started its descent, it also initiated a left-hand turn, which I have a feeling that it did on purpose, since turning while descending in an emergency descent used to be a procedure for some time if the aircraft was following an airway, and that was done in order to avoid potential traffic below. But today I'm not sure that that is actually still required everywhere. Anyway, because of that, it would make sense for a system like this to be programmed to do that. And Garmin's own videos on the emergency descent mode seem to show a turning and descending aircraft. Let me know in the comments below if you know more about this, and while you're down there, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, normally in a situation where we have a cabin decompression, we want to descend down to 10,000 feet as soon as possible, where we can take our masks off. And that's because they are really, really uncomfortable and make communication very difficult, and also because our passengers might have less emergency oxygen than we pilots do. But like I said earlier, this particular aircraft stopped its descent at 18,000 feet. And that was probably because they were still flying over very high terrain at that point, with several peaks around them reaching over 13,000 feet. Again, a quite nifty feature if the aircraft actually took that into account. Now, that high level off in itself wasn't necessarily a problem, but it did mean that the pilots needed to keep their oxygen masks on whilst also working through their cabin depressurization checklists, and that part, the fact that they had to do all of that, is worth keeping in mind. Now, we don't know exactly how long it took for Garmin's second system, the emergency Autoland, to come into play, but when it did, it started by checking what airports with suitably long runways and GPS approaches were available, what the wind and other conditions looked at those airports, and it then decided that the best option for landing was Denver Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport. As we saw, the system then also switched the transponder over to 7700 to indicate that it was an emergency flight, and it started making radio broadcasts on both the airport arrival frequency and on 121.5, which is the international emergency frequency. But what were the pilots doing as this was all happening? Well, like I said, it's worth keeping in mind that a cabin depressurization and emergency descent is a high workload situation for any crew. And we've already explained that this crew were also forced to keep wearing their oxygen masks after descending, which likely didn't help. In their statement, Buffalo River Aviation offered several more clues for the reasoning behind the crew's actions. They stated that this flight was in instrument meteorological conditions, meaning inside clouds, near mountainous terrain, whilst also dealing with active icing conditions. All, meanwhile, they had to troubleshoot their loss of cabin pressure and crucially had to consider the binary, or all or nothing, function of the Garmin emergency systems. Given that situation, the crew therefore decided to let the emergency Autoland system continue flying the aircraft, making its way to the field and to talk to ATC, which is a really interesting decision since, as far as we know, Garmin didn't design this system to be used in that way. So, was it the right choice to make? Well, I should stress here that I haven't been trained to fly an aircraft with a system like this, but if you think about it, these pilots found themselves dealing with an emergency in bad weather and near high terrain. Meanwhile, the emergency Autoland system was taking away a lot of their workload. In all emergencies, pilots should aviate, navigate and communicate in that order. So these pilots now had a system available that was aviating, navigating and communicating for them. So with all of that in mind, it's maybe not that hard to see why leaving it to do its thing made a lot of sense to these pilots. But the fact that this system wasn't designed to be used in this manner also meant that this decision had some interesting implications. For example, the crew doesn't appear to have attempted to talk to air traffic control at all during this whole ordeal. Again, I don't have any training on the system, so we can't really know this for sure, but the use of the terms binary and all or nothing by the aircraft operator to describe these Garmin systems suggests that the pilots might have thought that contacting air traffic control would require them to first disengage the whole system, which they didn't want to do. Now, to be clear, Garmin's system is designed so that if the pilot is incapacitated, the passengers will be able to use touchscreens in the cockpit to operate radios and speak to someone on the ground, something that would understandably be very reassuring in an actual pilot incapacitation scenario. But we don't know if that particular function is available in all aircraft with this system, or if this communication interface is configured in a way that pilots can access. So my point here is that since the emergency Autoland system was not designed to be used when the pilots were not incapacitated, it's possible that the pilots in this case didn't train on how to contact air traffic control with the system flying the aircraft. Again, I am speculating a little bit here, but Let me know in the comments below if you have more insight into this. Specifically, what I would like to know is it possible for pilots to disengage the emergency Autoland but leave the plane's autopilot running in order to continue flying the approach generated by the emergency Autoland system? Because if you could do that, that would seem to be the best out of both worlds. I also want to be really clear here. I think that this system is fantastic and it solves a real problem that affects smaller aircraft flown by single pilot systems today. But I'm sure that Garmin and many operators and authorities out there are really looking into this sequence of events in this incident in order to see if they can learn anything from it, and maybe also factor in a few more scenarios than those that this system was originally designed for. Beyond general aviation planes and small private jets though, we still have one question left that I asked in the beginning of this video. If we can have a system like this today, retrofitted on a Beech King Air made in the 1980s, then why don't we have something similar for airliners? Well, the answer to that, as some of my regular viewers might remember, is that we sort of already do. At least one major manufacturer is seriously looking at a remarkably similar system. And of course, I'm referring to Airbus and its Up Next Dragonfly project. Like Garmin's emergency Autoland, this system would detect that the pilots in the cockpit are incapacitated and then look at available airports, check weather, look for any military or other restricted areas to avoid, and then execute a descent, approach and landing, whilst also declaring an emergency and making all of the appropriate radio calls. Now, I wouldn't expect to see a big red button for passengers to press in that case, but the obvious follow-up question here is, could such a system eventually replace one or maybe even both of the pilots? Well, I have made videos on this subject in the past, but the quick answer remains the same. These systems are for emergency use only, to be used as a final backup when all of our normal redundancy has already failed. The activation of either system would cause air traffic control to prioritize that aircraft above all others, which would be fine for one aircraft, but wouldn't really work well if multiple aircraft were involved. But even though Airbus's presentation of the Dragonfly project makes no mention of single pilot operations, it's no secret that Airbus, as well as some airlines, have been looking at the prospect of developing something like that in the future. But what has changed since the last time I made a video on this topic is that the regulators don't seem very impressed by this prospect. The likes of EASA in Europe, for example, suspended research into legislation around such a program as late as in June of 2025. Now, frankly, in my view, the best way to use fantastic new automation tools like the emergency Autoland system is to more or less do what those pilots did on that King Air. Use the automation to relieve workload and give the pilots the best possible chance to make good decisions and to keep everyone safe. But what do you think? Do you think that these pilots should have taken back the controls of their aircraft earlier? And what other technologies would you like to see in small and big aircraft in the future? Let me know in the comments below. I love reading them. Now, my team and I create these videos to keep you up to date with the latest developments in the aviation industry, breaking news and historical documentaries. And that takes a team of almost 15 people to do for all of our channels. Now, if you want to take a more active part in supporting that, then please scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot and sign up for as little or as much as you want. Everything really helps. Now, I am just getting ready to do a hangout with my Patreon tonight as this video is being recorded, and those are always some of the most fun hours of my entire month. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.